Hello, this is Joel Overton. So far for this problem on page 61 from your textbook, number 18, the radiation of baby teeth, we've seen how to take raw data and organize it into a group frequency distribution, and also to take this group frequency distribution then and build a histogram. And we all did that, by hand. Now what I'd like to do is to demonstrate how to do those things in Microsoft Excel. Recently I had a student stop by with an Apple computer, and I discovered that the edition of Excel 2011 is different than the version for the PC because there is no data analysis tool. It was actually removed in the newest edition. So in case you haven't already, make sure that you do enable it if you're on a PC computer. On Macintosh computers, they just don't have it. So to enable the data analysis tooling, go to File from Excel, select Options, click the Add In link on the left side of this dialog, and then either verify the Analysis Toolpak is one of the active application add-ins, or select it from the inactive application add-ins. This is not the Analysis Toolpak. This is the programmer's version of it, the development toolkit. This one is the one you want, the one that doesn't have the -VBA. If it's down here, you'll want to select it, for example, select Go, and then verify that in fact it is selected. If you did install the DDXL add-in that comes as part of the DVD with your textbook, that's great, but there won't be too much of a use for that. So if you did it, that's great. There will be a couple instances where we will use it, but if you didn't, no harm, no foul. After you do that, you can select data from the toolbar on top, and you'll see there is a data analysis toolkit installed on this toolbar, which gives you a whole wide range of things that you can do, including building a histogram. Now, one of the things that I can do, and I wanted to demonstrate first, is how to build a group frequency distribution. You can see that this is a data set that I've already created, which is identical to the data set from problem number 18. I put all the data from problem number 18 and entered it into this Excel spreadsheet. And I will upload this spreadsheet as part of the video link. So now that I have the data, one of the things I can do is, of course, take my data and organize it in this group frequency distribution. One of the things that I want to establish are these class boundaries, which I discussed in a previous video, and take all of the upper class boundaries now, 119.5, 129.5, 139.5, all the way down to the last upper class boundary of 189.5. I'll want to transplant those to the Excel spreadsheet. Now, don't worry about what I have listed over here. I'll explain that in a moment. But for now, here are the upper class boundaries for my group frequency distribution for the 8 classes I created for that distribution. Now, once I've got the upper class boundaries, what I'll want to do is to create my first group frequency distribution. So I'm going to come to Data in Excel, the Data tab, click on Data Analysis, and select Histogram, followed by the OK button. From here, what I'm going to do is specify my input range of raw data. And my raw data in my Excel spreadsheet starts at cell A2 and spans all the way down to cell A41. You don't necessarily see it, but it is there. So I'm going to retype this. This is A2 to A41. And then I'm going to click over here to the next input box for bin range. In other words, this next field is asking for a set representing the upper class boundaries for each class. And you can see the upper class boundaries for each class are here in cell D8 all the way down to cell D15. So you can drag and select those cells D8 through D15, and Excel will put these anchors here or you can just simply type them yourself as well if you see what they are. And then what I'm going to do is click on this button saying output range, because I want my group frequency distribution to display on the same spreadsheet as my table itself. And what I'm going to do here is, once I click that radio button for output range, I'm going to click on this input field, and then somewhere on this spreadsheet I'm going to click a blank cell. And notice it includes the reference right here. And when I'm done with this, I'm going to select OK. And when I do it, here is Excel's version of your group frequency distribution, where now the classes themselves are just specified by upper class boundary, and then the frequencies for each one of those classes now specified. Notice Excel also adds another class at the very bottom saying more, which is to say, when Excel took all the data in raw form and organized it according to class boundaries, if it would have found a piece of data that didn't fit within these classes, it would have tallied it up in this more, which would have let you know that maybe you didn't create your class boundaries correctly. And we can compare this now to what we've established earlier. You can see that 2, 2, 5, 9, 13, 6, 2, 1. Yeah. So we do have the correct group frequency distribution, just not necessarily, to the same level of detail as we did earlier by hand, where we included the lower class limits and whatnot. So that's one way that we can create a very quick and sloppy group frequency distribution. Next, what we'll want to do is create a histogram. And there are a couple ways we can do that, one of which is to use the data analysis toolkit. Now, if I use the data analysis toolkit, I'm going to come back to histogram now. All of the older input fields are still being displayed. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click chart output. You can see that there are a couple of other features here, namely we could create a Pareto chart, or we could establish cumulative percentage as well, which is relative cumulative frequencies. But really what we're interested in is just the graph. So I'm going to click this output range again. I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to specify a different field, right? Maybe over here. Then I'm going to click OK. And not only do I get the group frequency distribution again, but now I get this histogram. And I can resize it, right? There are image anchors or graph anchors on the edges here as well as on the top and bottom, so you can scale the graph to be any size you want. The corner scales you can scale diagonally. The top and left and right and bottom anchors here you can scale horizontally or vertically. And this is Microsoft Excel's first attempt at a histogram. But you notice there are certain characteristics of this histogram that aren't quite right. First of all, the vertical columns have awfully large gaps between them. And one of the characterizing qualities of a histogram is that the vertical bars are adjacent to each other. So we'll need to fix that. Also, notice that the class boundaries aren't labeled here correctly according to the hash marks. So we'll have to fix that as well. And we'll also want to clean up pieces of this graph. We'll want to give it a more descriptive title. We'll want to change these labels so they're more descriptive as well. We'll need to get rid of this frequency, because this is just a label for one bar. And we could create a stacked histogram of several data sets to compare and contrast them, in which case maybe we would need a label, but for this one we don't need it, so we could simply just delete it. Oops, not that. Yeah. Now, this is one way we could start to build a histogram. Another way that we could start to build a histogram is as follows. Here, I've retyped my graph, my group frequency distribution, my table, with its lower and upper class boundaries, as well as my frequencies. And really, you don't really even need to retype them. Once you get this group frequency from Excel, you're there. Because now what I could do is I could highlight my group frequency distribution just as is, or I could type it myself and then come up here to Insert and select a column graph. And this is identical to what you would do in an Apple computer as well. Whereas with Apple, if you don't have the data analysis Toolpak, you wouldn't be able to use that histogram feature for the data analysis Toolpak. But you can choose a column graph based on this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select column graph, and I'm just going to choose the first one, a clustered column. And look what I get. I get something that's very, very similar, except there are some components missing compared to what we used with the other feature, that data analysis toolkit. Now, in order to clean this up, this is what we do. So I'm just going to overlap that text there. It's not that important. I'm going to take my histogram that I built, and the steps for cleaning both of these up are very similar. I'm going to delete my series label, and now I want you to observe the following. First things first is I want to clean up these columns. Now, what I want to do is click on one of these blue bars in such a way that you see these anchors appear around just the columns, right? If you were to click just a little ways off of that like this, notice how those anchors appear around the graph and not just on the columns, right? And to get off of that, you can click anywhere off of the graph and then just come back here, and there I go. Now, after I have anchors around all of the blue bars like this, I'm going to right-click on the blue bar and select Format Data Series. Let me redo that. Format Data Series. This is going to open up a dialog, and what I'll want to do is this. I want to specify that I don't want any gaps between my vertical columns. So I move the slider all the way down to 0. And notice what that did to the graph. You can move the slider in different spots, and oh yeah, look at that. Now, next thing, you can barely see and distinguish the columns from each other. So I'm going to come over here to fill. Well, maybe not that. Border color, maybe not that either. Oh, actually, yes, border color. I'm going to make a select line. And I want to choose a color that's like white or perhaps black, but not blue, because then it'll just blend in with everything else. And I'm actually going to choose white. I'll also want to move my slider to 0 transparency. And now when I do that, you're like, what? Nothing changed, Joel. Well, look at this. If I click off of the graph, now you can see the columns in such a way that at least you can distinguish them. It may look, you may think, well, now I have gaps in there. Well, not really. It's just that we included white borders to give the impression that these are actually distinct vertical bars and not just one mass. So, one part cleaned up. Next, we need to clean up these labels. Now, I need to create some space in the graph. If I click on the graph, this is the entire graph. If I reshape it in any way, the whole graph gets reshaped. And I don't have a lot of space to add things that I'm going to need, like a title or labels or a source. So what I'm going to do is, instead of clicking on the whole graph, I'm just going to click on this part of the graph. Notice how the anchors appear around the graph. And I'm going to resize this. And notice I'm getting some space here now. I want to give myself some space within this border of the overall graph managed by Excel. And there we go. Then I'm going to want to select these numbers at the bottom, because what I want are the class boundaries to display at the bottom. So I'm going to select just these labels at the bottom, which creates a nice little anchor around them. I'm going to right click on it and say Format Axis. Now in the axis options, it's the labels I want to change. So instead of putting the labels anywhere, I'm just going to select None, which gets rid of all of them. And you're like, oh, but I want them. To get those to display right on the axes in the way that we want them, using the values we want, is very difficult. So I'm just going to get rid of them and then add them myself. Stay tuned for part 2 of this video in just a moment.